So, welcome everyone. It's nice to see so many faces online. It's nice to see so many names online popping up as well. And we're very excited to welcome you to the second session of the Brave Conversations series, which is something that a conversation we're very excited to have with all of you and to take your questions as we go to chat in the end. So, thank you for joining us for this online Zoom session and for being part of the second season of Brave Conversations in SoTL series. It's wonderful to have such a strong community gathered here, and we're grateful that you've chosen to spend this time with us in conversation. This is the second of 3 panel discussions in season 3 of Brave Conversations in SoTL. It's a collaboration between Mount Royal University's Mokakiiks Center for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning and our colleagues at the University of Calgary's Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning. So through this series, we bring together a diverse and international community of scholars to engage with ideas at the very edge of our SoTL practice. This season, we're really interested in thinking about how risk is taken up, how it's experienced, and how it's sustained within SoTL. And today's conversation focuses on failure as a condition of risk and as part of our broader theme of exploring vulnerability, possibility, and failure in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So my name is AnneMarie Dorland. I'm an associate professor of marketing and the director of the Mokakiiks Center for SoTL at Mount Royal University, and I'm pleased to be facilitating today's conversation in partnership with colleagues at the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning at the University of Calgary. So to begin in a good way, with a commitment to truth and reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we're gathering in conversation. While many of you are joining from different places, our 4 panelists and I are speaking to you from Mokakiiks in the Treaty 7 regions of southern Alberta. This land is home to the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Akathistoni Nakota, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I'd like to acknowledge this land as a place of learning and to commit to ongoing relationships here, grounded in respect and reciprocity. Before we begin,
sorry to interrupt you. I think that we lost the slide view, and so if you could share one more time,
I would love to.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Erica. You got to keep me on track with this, and I so appreciate the help because I am living in a land of Zoom that feels uncomfortable and scary. Okay,
that looks great.
This looks good. Does that feel good too? Great. Okay. So I'm going to leave that up there for a moment because they are important words. And I'm going to learn how to use a mouse again because I have opposable thumbs. Excellent. So before we begin our conversation, I would also like to encourage you to use the chat throughout the session to share questions, reflections, and ideas as they emerge. So Dr. Cherie Wilmer will be monitoring the chat for us, and we'll make space at the end of the session to bring forward questions and insights from our online community. So, too often, failure is something that we treat as a condition to be avoided in our SoTL work, to avoid, to conceal, or to move past really quickly. Yet in SoTL, we're also working with complex, relational, and often uncertain environments. It's not only inevitable, it's also generative. So in shaping this session, we wanted to ask what it would mean to take failure seriously as a part of our scholarly process. Our panelists will help us explore failure not only as an endpoint, but an essential part of the creative and intellectual processes, and is something that can be normalized, examined, and even valued within our SoTL ecosystems. We're joined today in conversation by Dr. Natasha Kenny, Director of the University of Calgary's Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning, Dr. Jen Boman, Associate Professor and Faculty Development Consultant at Mount Royal University, and Dr. Alyssa Counsell, Associate Professor of Psychology and Teaching Fellow from Toronto Metropolitan University. So thank you all for joining us. I'm excited to turn the Zoom mic over to you for today's discussion and to ask you to provide a quick introduction for our SoTL community about yourself and your work. So if it's okay, Natasha, I'll turn to you first. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe share why you think it's important that we talk about failure as part of our SoTL work?
Yeah, my name obviously is Natasha, and today I think I'll be framing this conversation. I think it's important to know that not only am I an executive director here at the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning, a SoTL scholar, but I'm also a certified executive coach. So maybe bringing some of that lens into the conversation today. And I think mainly for me, so a couple things you might want to know about me. I'm training for the Calgary half marathon right now, so my legs are a little sore after a long run, and I'm happy to see the 20-degree weather rather than 30 centimeters of snow, because that's made it hard to navigate lately. And can you repeat your question, AnneMarie, why it's important, why failure is important?
I sure can. I'm curious about just why you think it's important we talk about that. Why is it important in SoTL? Why should we even talk about it in the first place?
Because we're humans in addition to being scholars. And honestly, for me, this is it's a deep human condition. Failure is part of the human condition, and it takes practice to accept and to move beyond. So I think it's part of the human experience. And one of my quests as a leader here is to ensure that we recognize the humanness of our experience at work in addition to the professionalness. So I'll maybe leave it at that.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you for sharing that. Jen, I will turn to you next. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why on earth should we even be spending an hour on our Monday mornings talking about failure as part of SoTL?
Thanks, AnneMarie. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Boman, and I work as an educational developer at Mount Royal. And my background is in educational psychology, and my teaching background is in psychology. And I'm approaching this conversation both from my work in educational development and also from my experience with teaching students. And I think what Natasha just said, that failure is a human experience, is so important. I think that failure has kind of taken on a different kind of meaning for ourselves and for our students. And I think it's important to ground it back in human experience. I think sometimes when we fail, instead of viewing it as just an expected component of learning, sometimes what I hear my students say is, I'm a failure, right? It's not just that I failed, but I'm a failure. And we've internalized it in a very different way. And I'm particularly interested in kind of the systems perspective that might shape how we view failure and how we can meaningfully reframe failure as a productive part of our academic work and as a productive part of student learning as well.
That's great. Thanks, Jen. And Alyssa, I'll turn to you next. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then also just how does this show up in your work, and why do you think it's an important thing for us to talk about today?
Thanks, AnneMarie. So some of you may be thinking Toronto Metropolitan University is not at the University of Calgary or Mount Royal. So I'll just begin by saying that I got involved in this group because I am on sabbatical and have had the absolute pleasure of spending time here in Calgary at the University of Calgary, as well as visiting my colleagues at MRU. So I, like Jen, I have a background in psychology. So I'm an associate professor and a teaching fellow at my institution. A lot of my work pertains to how to better improve sort of learning and teaching in a statistics context. And for me, I think everything that the other panelists said really resonates in terms of sort of that process. For me, the other thing about why it's important to continue to have these conversations around failure is really because this helps to model to our students that this is not just something that happens and then you get over it, that this is kind of a lifelong thing, that failure is something that we will continue to experience. And we can use that as opportunities to sort of reflect and learn more. And a lot of my most interesting insights in terms of research findings have actually come from like failed quasi experiments or some things that I thought were really exciting and was sure that this was going to be a slam dunk in terms of a pedagogical approach, only to have it kind of fall flat and then really have to re-examine my own assumptions and understanding of the literature and to just engage a lot more deeply. And it's led to new lines of inquiry. So I think that there's a lot of, different ways that we can talk about failure, from the sort of mentoring approach, from a mental health approach of exactly what Jen said, that it doesn't mean you're a failure. This is a necessary part of moving on and being human. So that's why I'm here today.
That's fantastic. And we're so glad that you are. So I'm going to open up with a conversation or question for all of our panelists. And then I'm going to get a little bit more focused in terms of putting each of you on the hot seat as we move forward. But our first kind of broad question to get our conversation going is to ask about what counts as failure. It's such a tricky and nebulous term, and it's so personal, it's individual, but it's also so public sometimes. So when we're thinking about SoTL, what do you think counts as failure, and who gets to define it? Is it individual educators, students, institutions, the field? What are we talking about when we're talking about failure? And I'll leave that open to anyone who wants to jump in first.
I can jump in just in terms of leadership perspective, because I know when we were preparing for this, I shared a reflection that I probably have a higher tolerance for failure. And it took me a while following that conversation to reflect on why that is and what I really mean by it. And I think if you look at definitions of failure, they'll point you towards it's an outcome that isn't expected, right? Whether that be a project that failed, relational conflict or failure, or a systems failure, like we're experiencing. When I think of systems failure, I think we think of our assessment practices right now and how Gen AI is challenging how we think about assessments. So, but for me, it's that tolerance kind of is like failure becomes a failure based on the meaning we make from it. So not necessarily the outcome, but what is the meaning we're making from it? And I think when we think of that, and Alyssa and Jen, I'm glad you touched on the shame-based fear that we often feel by failure. And I think that when we see failure through the lens of shame or a need to control something or compare ourselves to other or please others, fear is very externally driven. And for me, through a lot of coaching, through life experiences, Alyssa, I love how you framed failure and the need to reflect on it as a lifelong practice, because I think it's really important for us to explicitly say that when we experience failure, it's hard. It challenges our identity. It challenges our sense of competence. It challenges our confidence. And that is a common human experience. But for me, especially as a leader and a human, when I look at failure through a lens of learning, through possibility, through hope, we actually take control of our failure, right? It becomes more internally driven and more productive, as many of us have said. So as a leader, I'm not usually concerned about whether something worked or whether something didn't. I'm really interested in what happens after. What's the quality of reflection that happens after, and how are we building upon that learning, not only as an organization, but as individuals, teams, and how are we feeding that up to the organization around us? So that systems approach as well. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm curious to hear what Alyssa and Jen have to say.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in next, and I appreciate those thoughts, Natasha, and I agree with what you've just said. And for me, if we think about failure as adults, it's such a contrast to what we see with very young children. And for young children, what we really see is kind of this joy of experimentation and this joy of play. So when young children, have a situation where the outcome maybe doesn't go what they expected, they just keep immersing themselves in that process of play, and it's just part of their learning. And I think for a lot of us, there's that shift as we kind of go through childhood and become adults, that we're more aware of kind of this consequence of not meeting particular outcomes or not having things go a particular way. So just going back to your original question, AnneMarie, I think part of the reason it's important to have this conversation is because if we don't kind of explicitly define failure and talk about failure, we're taking our cues from what we're seeing going on in the environment around us. And I think, a lot of times, Natasha, you referred to kind of this shame and secrecy around failure. If all that we're seeing is success stories and a focus on outcomes and a focus on product, it becomes very difficult to speak about the process and speak about the discomfort of things not going in a particular direction or not going in a particular way. And that shame and secrecy then kind of spirals, right? So then we don't hear those stories of the difficulty or challenge. So I think that with failure as that kind of common part of learning of human experience, it's particularly important to think about how we want to define it for ourselves and for our students, and really think through how that relates to our actions. So Alyssa, you mentioned this idea of kind of modeling failure for our students. So how can we respond in more productive ways and really reframe that experience for ourselves?
Yeah, so just piggybacking off of what was said, I completely agree with everything that we've discussed thus far. For me, like failure has really shifted because if it's defined of not meeting sort of expectations, it's whose expectations. And I'm sort of at more of a mid-career stage now. I'm a couple years post-tenure. And so for me, in terms of failure in SoTL, if my tenure, the bar for tenure depends on things like publications, things like conference presentations, and we know that the peer review system sometimes is biased towards things that are positive, and we don't sort of inherently in academia value the failures in the same way that we value the products that worked and the things that worked in terms of the perceptions. But if all we're focusing on is sort of these narrow things of this is what worked, then why didn't this other thing work? What's all this other stuff that we're missing behind the scenes by only focusing on the things that worked? And it's also a problem with resources of if we're not seeing the failures out front, then we're going to continue to kind of go down lines and we're missing out on kind of like those shared pieces of, okay, well, if this worked, for you and it didn't work for me, why? If this failed for you, maybe it will fail for me and why? And sort of understanding really at a deeper level, this idea of, we're trying to learn something here. And so if something works and something doesn't work, both of those are different kinds of data and different kinds of information. I'm lucky enough post tenure now that I don't have to care about my institutional criteria for success as opposed to failure. But I think it's always important to kind of have these in the back of our mind of, failure does come with consequence. Failure often is defined externally for senior students who are looking to sort of make their careers for postdoc fellows, for early career faculty. But we have to find ways to kind of, figure out for ourselves how to frame things, how to take things in a new direction. And obviously, as your career goes on, then the more and more we're able to kind of define what failure is for ourselves and to be leaders in the field so that we're able to kind of pass that forward for the next generation as well.
Absolutely. And I think what's really interesting and what I hear all three of you say is the impact of those systems that we have set up, that we work within, and that we continue to kind of co-create, and the pressure to fit work that maybe fits more of a failure context than it does just an automatic kind of expected outcome context into that system. So Jen, I'm wondering if I can turn to you. This makes me think about the ways that we reframe failure as normal or growth oriented, or how we could do that, not just for our students, but for our own scholarship and academic journeys as we move forward. And you talked about that kind of moving away from that state of play that we exist in when we're so much younger. What could we do in our systems to change our systems to retain some of that joy of failure and experimentation? Are there places where you see that getting blocked, where people automatically get shut down and discouraged when they're trying to take risks in the systems when you're working with faculty?
Yeah, I think, there's something about the vulnerability of failure that's often in direct contradiction of what is asked of us and our students. So we're often asked to show that we're award-winning teachers. We're often asked to successfully obtain research funding. So all of these things are sort of in contrast to being vulnerable and saying, this didn't quite go the way I planned. I'm kind of in this process of learning from it. And I think, we can think of our students as well. Quite often we say that we value learning, but when it comes down to it, we're in this system where grades are currency. And we can say we value learning all we want, but for students, the consequence is the grade. So that becomes kind of that metric of success and failure. So I think we're kind of working against systems in some way. And I think sometimes that incentivizes us against failure. So if we look at what happens with grading and assessment systems very often, if we have an assessment system where students are not allowed kind of retries or rewrites or given feedback and that chance to improve, they're incentivized really not to take risks, not to challenge themselves, but to do things kind of in a very efficient way. And I see that sometimes in our own work. So there's this kind of tension that we're navigating. We're in a system that often values product and outcome. And to be more process oriented takes a bit more time. It takes time for reflection. And it's a bit of a tension that we're all navigating, I think. But I think the unintended kind of consequence of avoiding failure is that often we don't get to transformational learning. So Alyssa was talking about sort of, part of failure in this experience is that we learn from failure. But if we don't spend time doing that, we can miss out on that learning. So I think where I've seen some meaningful cracks in my own experience, just thinking about SoTL and about academia more broadly, is where I often see cracks is when there's a focus on kind of narratives and storytelling. Where are those opportunities where we can take a broader perspective and tell our stories, which includes those experiences of failure? I think I've seen a meaningful crack in this with things like ungrading and alternative assessment. I mean, it feels really disingenuous for me to talk about failing when I'm saying, I might be saying to my students through my assessment system, yeah, I can fail all I want, but you only get this one opportunity to get it right, right? But the more we can kind of play with ungrading and actually model things for students, the better. And then just a third example of where I think I've seen a meaningful crack in our kind of culture and narrative around failure is actually in educational development work, in taking time with people to really share stories and talk about experiences of SoTL and research and teaching. And I think there's something that's really interesting to me about framing failure around an individual versus a collective experience. And I think sometimes when we feel like we're failing or when we feel like failures, it's actually, relates to the system that we're in. The system where there's kind of no obvious answer, but we're operating in this tension of, oh, I'm trying to do something with ungrading that's really cool, but my students are still in a system where they're focused on grades. So how do I resolve that? But when we start to view it as this collective problem, this shared challenge, I think it kind of opens up ways of hopeful direction. It might not be something that I can solve on my own. It doesn't absolve me of personal responsibility in trying to change that. But when we can talk about it as a group and share that vulnerability and share challenges, I think there's a lot of different opportunities for hopeful learning and change there. And I've been rambling on. I'll stop there.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'll open it up to Natasha and Alyssa. What cracks are you seeing maybe in our culture where that's becoming a little easier to think about failure as a generative part of the learning experience?
Feel free to jump in, Alyssa, but I want to go to that systems perspective because I think that's come up a few times. And Jennifer, I love the notion of these cracks appearing. And throughout this conversation, I've also been going back to Lee Shulman's fundamental work of how do we make teaching and learning visible? How do we make it community property where we're not operating in individual silos? So I think that's part of it. And I think we're moving towards that. And Jen, I love you really amplifying the very ethos of educational development work, and SoTL work is usually making things more public. So that's a positive. I think we're seeing SoTL as a whole as a crack in the system, which I just want to name. I do want to just give some practical examples of our reward systems, our tenure and promotion processes. So we really do need to ask ourselves, how are these processes making space for critical reflection and to model and talk about failure? And I think that can be done. So even when I think of the University of Calgary Teaching Awards process, right? When we have a dossier that is meant to be grounded in critical reflection on practice, you're not basing excellence on any one criteria, and you're actually requiring folks to not only talk about how they're gathering feedback on their teaching and learning, but what they've learned from both their successes and things that haven't worked out. And as an individual instructor too, a practice that we could implement is, every course outline saying, here are the 3 changes I've made to this course based on what didn't work and the feedback I received last semester. So there are some real, I think, practical ways, and I love that we're focusing on practice here because it goes beyond any one policy. I think for me too, for example, although our academic staff aren't required to have a formal performance conversation at the University of Calgary with their head or head equivalent, I really I open up my office to annual conversations with all academic staff to think about what they learned last year, what their successes were, but also a question that I've learned to adapt with the academic staff here is, when were you most humbled and what did you learn from it? So even saying we don't always have to say what didn't work or what failed. It's like, when were you most humbled and what did you learn from it? So all of these conversations start to normalize the narrative. And sometimes I don't even love the word normalize, but really make visible that failure isn't just accepted, it's an accepted part of the academic experience and of our academic cultures. So I'll leave it at that. Alyssa, maybe you have things to add to that.
I just want to give all the hearts for all these comments because they're just resonating so much. So the things that are sort of coming to mind for me to share are there's 2 things that both Jen and Natasha touched on in terms of sort of the alternative assessment, as well as sort of making these conversations and changes more visible. So I think my sort of contribution is I'd like to just kind of share an experience that I think illustrates this, of my most humbling moment that led to that was not a failure, even though it felt like a failure at the time. I came back sort of fall 2022 after being away for mat leaves. COVID is still rampant. I decided to do a total course redesign, change all my assessments into ungrading for my grad students. I just blew everything up. And I was sick as a dog as my daughter went to daycare for the first time. I'm teaching multiple courses. My husband was working out of town, and just everything that could have gone wrong, went wrong for me every step of the way. I had mistakes in my course notes. I had issues in the labs. But what I did in that semester was really, for my graduate students in this stats class, is focus on process to try to reduce this fear of failure. So every time they're submitting an assignment, they're writing a reflection letter about what they're doing, what they're learning, what they think their failures were thus far, how they're going to improve them. And I continually engaged in dialogue with my students through comments and these assignments as I'm failing every single week, every step of the way in some capacity, but I'm explaining to them, here's what I've done differently. Here's why this didn't work. I'm glad you're asking this question because it shows that this was a mistake on my part. And it was just this collective situation of everybody doing a lot of things wrong, but learning from them deeply, but continually talking about it the whole time. And I felt like I was often tired. I wasn't on my game. It was my worst semester as a teacher. And you know what? That's when I was nominated for one of the most prestigious university awards for teaching. And I won it because it really came down to sort of this back and forth and relationality that is so important in SoTL, of it's not just about this one grade, this one assignment that you were your absolute best of the best, but you are a human, you're learning alongside your students, and you're showing them that you care about them. And that failure, and the more and more you talk about it, it just shows that we are fostering this psychological safety. We are reshaping communities by having these conversations, by engaging in process, and by ourselves learning from it and moving forward and not letting that kind of get us down, even though for me, it was such a slog. I never want to relive that semester. But in the end, there was so much richness and amazing moments that came from that. So I just like to share that in terms of an example of both the ungrading and the sort of most humbling moments, if you will.
Absolutely. And that makes me think, Natasha, a lot about something I know you think carefully about quite a bit, which is experiencing and learning through that failure part, which is so grounded in that psychological safety that's required for that.
Yeah,
So-
and you know, can I just add to that, AnneMarie, a little bit? Like I think also, so certainly, and I just want to name Amy Edmondson's work with psychological safety. If folks aren't familiar with it, please learn through her. And psychological safety really means the ability to ask questions, make mistakes, to offer insights, to disagree without fear of repercussion. And I think if we step back in academia, I can even name spaces where I don't feel that sense of safety, but I do control as a leader, how am I helping to create those sense of psychological safety? For me as a whole, too, I've really learned a lot from Kristen Neff's works on self-compassion in terms of how are we naming what we're feeling. And again, the affective dimension of this is really important that we name, I think. How are we being mindful about those experiences, and how are we viewing those from a lens of compassion and being gentle and kind to ourselves and others as we navigate through these hard experiences? The other thing I'm thinking about as we go through here is like just naming, I think that like metacognition is a superpower in higher ed, right? That's what we're all talking about, aren't we? Is learning about how to think and ensuring that students have, and we as researchers have that capability to foster metacognition through all of our learning, our research, our leadership, our other experiences in higher education. So I'll just leave it at that. Sorry, AnneMarie, I got excited.
No, that's the perfect continuation of this conversation, because what I'm wondering, I can ask you specifically, is what would a culture that really values risk and failure, an academic culture, I guess I should be more specific, that really does kind of put your money where your mouth is, values risk and failure, wants to build that sense of psychological safety in our policies, our language, our leadership behaviors, what would that even look like in practice?
Well, I'm going to say look and feel like.
Sure,
So,
yeah.
because I think that we don't often talk about the feelings, and we need to ask that. The fundamental question is like, who do we want to be in this culture? How do we want to feel? And what do we do to get there? So I think that feeling of normalizing and really thinking about how in everyday spaces are we pausing and being curious about how we are experiencing failure. So yes, that language, those narratives are really important. And that means publicly naming on a regular basis, we tried this, or I tried this, but we tried this, it didn't work, and here's what we learned. So, and I think there's a bit of I do have to say that failure is very rarely individually experience it. Like there's so many things that impact it. So that's why I like that subtle shift from I to we too. I think that's important in our culture. So that's something that it looks like are those visible narratives, those storytelling, that leaning into failure a little bit more. I also think, so in an academic context, and I'm going to really build upon some of what I've learned from Leslie Reed, who's the current acting dean of the Faculty of Arts, but past vice provost teaching and learning at the University of Calgary. And even setting those conditions in our committees, our courses. So having conversations about collaborative agreements before you start a governance committee and a decision-making process. Like, how are we going to be in this space together so that we can have some of these more challenging and difficult and reflective conversations? I think for me too, it's also asking in the teams, like what would make it easier to be wrong in this space? So just setting some of those conditions for failure in our committees, in our working groups. Like how many working groups do we have where we focus on the terms of reference, we show the terms of reference in the first meeting, and then we throw it aside? Like, I think we need to make the space for how are we being in this space together? In addition to that, how are we doing in this space together? And maybe that's the key thing I'm making as I process this. And then I think it also means investing in leadership development and academic development, where we actually talk about things like psychological safety and how we all develop collective capacity for creating spaces that are psychologically safe and that help us learn from productive failure. I'll leave it at that because I want to hear from Jen and Alyssa too, because they're so inspiring.
Jen, what about for you? When we think about building and co-creating this culture that values failure, that sees it as a learning experience, as a generative process, what does that look like? What are we building and co-creating together?
Yeah, I love everything that you've just said, Natasha, and I agree with all of those things, and I love the examples that you've used to illustrate that. And I want to actually bring it back to a couple of things that Alyssa was building on as well, and it's the idea of process and relationships. And Natasha, a lot of your examples really related to that. But in order to take those risks and fail, there's something about grounding it in that human experience of failure and having relationships where we feel that we're able to do that, where it's being modeled by others in the community, where we're seeing failure not as kind of this one-time thing, just not as a failure to meet an outcome, but where it's just part of our learning experience that we're learning and growing, and framing it in the collective that we're learning and growing together. So I think there is something about framing failure as a collective experience that makes it a little bit easier. If I'm in this with others, it's somehow easier to take that risk versus just being on this stage by myself. And I think, in some respects, if we think about failure in relationship to our students and to our colleagues, there is something about failure that for me is intertwined a little bit with sense of belonging. So if I'm always trying to showcase my best self, it can be very difficult to be authentic, right? If I always have to do that. And we think of that with our students. Are we actually sometimes creating this false sense of belonging because they have to present a certain way, or they're only allowed to fail a certain number of times? And then, beyond that, that's not good, right? So by being vulnerable and by modeling failure as part of human experience and really diving deeper into the process, I think we are actually furthering our relationships with one another and furthering that sense of belonging in academic settings. A place where people can see themselves in the classroom, in research, in those committee meetings that you're talking about, Natasha, but through those different academic spaces. Turn it over to you, Alyssa. I'd love to hear more about what you'll say.
Yeah, totally agree. The thing that is kind of hard for some people to do, but is just kind of a necessary truth in my experience, is that you need to have people who will go to bat. That like there needs to be some kind of change makers in terms of some of these systems. And it's really uncomfortable for those kind of groundbreaking individuals who are willing to be the ones to say, hey, actually, here's all the ways that I failed. Actually, I don't think we are fairly evaluating these students and to be the ones who push back. And it's really, really hard to be that person. And it took me several years into my position before I could start doing that. But being, especially those who are mid-career or later career that have that safety already in terms of their position of being the one to say, hey, here's what we're evaluating in terms of our rubric for the candidates who are applying for this job, for our students for scholarship. We need to reevaluate these criteria because we are so focused on these particular things and we're losing out on all this whole other regard. And so being that person to kind of push back, go to bat for students, go to bat for your colleagues in terms of when they're quote unquote like not meeting an external criteria or they've experienced too many failures and not enough successes. So in terms of more of like a systems-based thinking, like we really are, in some ways we feel like we're all these individuals, we are in a system, but just kind of being a louder voice and being willing to put yourself out there and starting to get buy-in and kind of doing a lot of that relational work to work with folks and demonstrate that like you are really here to help uplift and support people. I think that a lot of that really kind of stems from a smaller group of individuals. But once that starts happening, then it kind of has this trickle down effect. It won't work in every committee. It won't work in every system, but we really are, moving towards this more sort of communal approach. So that's the thing that's sort of really coming to mind for me in terms of the systems thinking that systems have to start somewhere in terms of change. And it's really on us who do have that degree of safety and an importance for us to go to bat for folks who are in more precarious positions to really try to change some of those norms.
Absolutely. And Alyssa, what you're saying about going to bat, being both an accomplice and an ally in that way, it makes me think about some of your work around that shifting that fear of failure that I know we all feel, though we can understand why it's important. It's still scary. And it's scary for our students as well. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit of what you've learned about the challenges of researching failure, both ours and students in your SoTL work, and what it takes to shift that fear out of the way.
Yeah, so I think always the biggest thing is measurement. For me, it always comes back to like, how are we measuring these things that we see in our students, and we can see these shifts, and how does this sort of come through? And so I think that's been a real struggle for a lot of my work, where there's things that I'm doing sort of a quasi experiment, or, examining kind of student experience or things through different surveys and stuff like that. But what I see from my students and as I interact with them, sometimes that doesn't translate really well in terms of the survey questions or the particular nature of how the study was designed. So that continues to sort of be an ongoing challenge for me, and, making me think about different ways of collecting data, different approaches, and different questions to be asking students. But a lot of the work that I've done where I have incorporated things like ungrading or sort of a different approach with sort of an aim for trying to kind of help improve student learning, help improve student attitudes, things like this. Really, what all of these kind of failed pedagogical experiments have led me to is the things that I tried to kind of control for early on, or kind of buffer against, ended up being the most impactful. So if we have two different instructors and two different approaches trying to say, okay, well, we want to control for the kind of student instructor rapport, but that ends up being like this huge effect that, like, in the end, it's actually not the particular approach to teaching. It comes down to this relationality. And that's what all of these failed pedagogical experiments are leading me to, is that it's actually this relationality. And that's what it is. It's really impossible to remove the instructor and that dynamic between the instructor and their students from the particular approaches that we take in class. And so if this is kind of like this underlying finding that I keep having, it demonstrates that power of modeling and continuing to have these conversations around fear of failure. And one of the things that came out in one of my research projects, where I was explicitly investigating kind of the impact of alternative assessment or ungrading on, anxiety in the classroom, on the student experience. This is a quote that I feel like will never leave me. There was a student who said, I feel like this approach has allowed me to feel like I am working alongside and learning from an expert rather than being judged by an expert. And that was just such a powerful piece for me to take from this project, that really reframed the way that I interact with my students, the conversations I have. And if I'm asking them for process and I'm talking about their learning, I really want that to be the approach is, the focus is on the learning, not the evaluation. And in order for students to open up and really allow some mistakes, you can't penalize them for that in terms of an assessment approach. And you can't just be this person silently over here giving nothing back. Like, there needs to be that relationality and that psychological safety that Natasha has really emphasized, that goes both ways. So it's really tricky with the power differential and the dynamic in the classroom. But really, a lot of my failed experiments are just highlighting how important that relationality is and how impactful that is for our students.
It's really interesting to think about. And Jen, I'm wondering how that translates into your work, especially with faculty, in terms of how you can help them shift that fear of failure in the same way. Is it relationships there too, or is there anything else we add to that mix when we get to that level?
It's really interesting when I think about some of the most meaningful conversations I've had with groups of faculty attending kind of educational development programming. It's not actually about the success stories or, about sharing ideas. It's actually these really deep conversations about feeling like we're failing and living in these tensions of, we're in the system that focuses on one thing. I'm trying to do this. It seems in direct contrast. There's no solution, or at least no immediate solution. And hearing that other people are experiencing that, there's something about kind of just sitting in a process where we're identifying tensions and figuring out not necessarily how to resolve them, but where we sit in that and how we move forward in little ways. That's been really powerful. So I think, part of when we're thinking about kind of moving through failure and kind of moving through learning, part of it comes to allowing ourselves the space and the grace to kind of sit in an uncomfortable space and to really focus in on process and to do that in relationship. So I think it does come down to relationships, and I think it also comes down to the space for process. So not immediately jumping to, well, how do I resolve this, or how do I fix this, or how do I overcome failure? But Alyssa was saying earlier to really focus on how can I grow from this? How can I learn from this? So I think in terms of those groups of faculty, it is about kind of that conversation around acknowledging there's kind of larger system things, there's tensions here, and that appreciation that other people are experiencing the same thing. And so I think that applies both to how we interact with one another as colleagues and also how we interact with our students. So I think a lot of times when we think about kind of how to take risks with failure, thinking about that safety of relationship and also thinking about allowing ourselves the time to take those risks. Sometimes, we do need more time to spend in process in order to get there.
Natasha.
AnneMarie, yeah, I unmuted because Jen just beautifully modeled self-compassion in process, right? Like that whole framework is based on naming what happened, being mindful of it, like establishing that we're all experiencing failures or things that didn't work out as we planned, and it is so hard. Like I think part of it is not being toxically positive about this. So it's going to be okay. We'll all work through it. No, it is hard. And then one of the things, Jen, that I just wanted to build upon is sometimes one of the most important questions I can either ask myself or others is, what would you say to a colleague that was experiencing this? So when you take it away from yourself and the mind trap you're stuck in, and we all get stuck in the shame mind trap, please, I don't want to, I get stuck in this on a weekly basis for sure. But for me, it's knowing what are the tools I have in my toolbox to get me out of that mind trap of shame. And often that is asking that question of saying, what would I say to a colleague in this? Or it's seeking formal coaching from a critical or friend, or I have a great Gen AI coach that helps me work through this as well. Gen AI has been shown to be a very sophisticated thought partner when used intentionally. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that. But Jen, thanks for naming that and for bringing. I think folks in the chat I noticed talked about building students' capacity for resilience, but I think it goes beyond individual resilience. I think we need to shift more to collective resilience and systems resilience.
That's a perfect place to kind of wrap up our discussion and move us into some of those questions. So thank you for that, Natasha. Cherie Wilmer has been collecting our questions so that I don't go cross-eyed trying to stare at Zoom too much. And I so appreciate it, Cherie. Thanks, you're doing a great job. And we have some really fantastic ones from our audience that I'd like to bring to our conversation today. One that's coming in is about positionality. And this is an observation also that's been shared by other people in the chat. And it's really a question about who's allowed to fail. And perhaps even more specifically, how do our identities and our positionality influence how open someone can be with failure and how receptive someone can be to accepting failure of others as part of the process? So it's a question that's also been reflected in some observations coming throughout about who's allowed to fail, and how can we think carefully about the privilege of failure in this way.
I mean, I think Alyssa had some really nice comments on this topic earlier. And I think, one thing that's worth highlighting again is that risk and vulnerability looks different to different individuals. depending on where you're coming from and what the consequences look like for you. So I think being sensitive to that idea that what might be a small risk for me might be a huge risk for someone else, and bringing that to our awareness and interactions. And I think, Alyssa, what you were mentioning earlier, and I think you used the word change makers, is the idea of being aware of our own privilege. So for some of us, there is that responsibility if we want to change the culture around failure and create something different, that we do have a responsibility to lead by example, to model how we respond to failure, to kind of push at the edges of where we can in terms of changing the definition of what counts as failure. So I think that's a really important conversation to have collectively.
Yeah, and I've posted quite a bit on my blog about psychological safety and had many questions from folks that openly identify within racialized or minority groups and openly say that I've never experienced this in higher ed. So I think we need to listen to those conversations. Some of what we've been talking about in some of the current research on psychological safety is showing that, when we measure environments that are higher in psychologically safety, it does make failure vulnerability better for those who identify within equity deserving groups. But this is a reality of our system, and this is why I think we need to look beyond any one change and look at how are we influencing the system as a whole, from our policies and practices at an institutional level, for how we work within our faculties, departments, and teams. And this is really where I'd like to focus as an educational leader, because I think that if you have really incredible practices around teaching and learning at an individual level. We do that a lot at the Taylor Institute, provide support for developing teaching expertise for individuals and small groups. We do have very strong policies for teaching and learning. I think at the University of Calgary and visions, things can always be tweaked. But if you don't have strong microcultures and educational leadership and faculties and departments, it becomes very hard to do all of what we're talking about today. So that's where I think emphasizing how leaders can develop those psychologically safe spaces and also lean into the difficult conversations that need to be shifted if we really are to create the strong cultures for teaching and learning and the scholarship of teaching and learning that we hope most to see.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add, over and above this, when I have students come to me asking about, what they can disclose and in what context, I'm not going to give blanket advice, because their identity and their positionality is really going to matter. And a part of psychological safety is also thinking about the other systems that they're a part of and helping to protect them from those systems as best as I possibly can. So there isn't like an easy catch all of how do we solve this? Of course, we all have, different identities that are going to result in some privilege or some disadvantage depending on where it is. But I think the key conversation is continuing to think about this, to be respectful and mindful that things will look different for different people. And as Jen said, for those of us with more privilege, being willing to kind of, put our necks on the line, or to be at the forefront of making sure that these conversations are being contextualized and that we are doing things that will, benefit the community as a whole.
Thank you for that. I'm going to tuck one last teeny question in here just so that we can stay on time, but I really want to hear your thoughts. It's a question about resilience, and it's framed really nicely by Carrie McMillan as a chicken or egg question. So it's, do we need to teach and model resilience before we ask students, peers, and colleagues to be open to failure? Or is being open to failure a way of learning resilience, right? It's a loop. So not that it's a loop that we can put a pin in for absolutely everybody, but what are your thoughts about whether or not learning from failure helps develop resilience, or is it the other way around?
I mean, I think it's both. That's kind of I'm not going to pick one. I'm just going to say it's both. I think it is both. I mean, I think that Natasha was saying earlier that we do need to help students with that skill set of being able to learn from failure. So I think, if we can be open to failure, um, having that experience of failure can help us with that resilience. However, it could also have an opposite consequence, right? If we're not kind of engaging in that learning, it may actually lead to avoidance of future failure if we're not kind of processing it in a particular way. So I think we do need to teach and model a skill set for students. I think there are some skills and some mindsets that can help students think through failure productively. But also, I think there is an encouragement to be open to failure that's needed as well. And I think that can be on an individual level, but also as we're talking more broadly on a systems level. So have we set up the conditions within our classrooms where there is an openness and ability to be open to risk, to be open to failure, and be willing to discuss what that looks like with our students.
And ensuring that the failure is not high stakes. Because the early failures that are low stakes in the beginning set the groundwork for that openness and that resilience and that ability to fail and see it's not catastrophic. Whereas if those early experiences are, I am now in a class where I'm learning for the first time, I'm overwhelmed, and my first assessment is worth 30% of my grade, and I fail on that, that has now bombed my grade, then we're getting back into these affective components of shame spirals of I'm the failure and all these other pieces. So exactly what Jen is saying is, thinking mindfully about how we're setting things up in terms of for our students that we're allowing them to fail without an absolute massive consequence. So building things in like participation grades. So I teach statistics to psychology students. We have to learn software, and setting it so that it's these small things where I'm telling you, I'm making this hard, but as long as you try it, you get the grades. You can fail and you can learn from it. It's just the effort. It's about the process. We're engaging in this as we're making our way to using this where it matters. But setting those foundations really early for the small failures, then it's kind of wiring the brain. Small failure, not catastrophic. Small failure, not catastrophic. And then that I think is a really important foundational piece in terms of continuing that sort of chicken and egg, where it now is this kind of bi-directional in process as we're working on this skill, but truly not having this be something that blows up a student's life.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add to that. What I'm hearing here is regardless of what comes first, it needs to be intentional and ongoing. That's what's kind of standing out for me is that, and I think even in the research on self-compassion, Kristen Neff really does emphasize the self-compassion is not a fixed trait. It is a learnable skill. So I think, I just think normalizing these conversations or amplifying these conversations and being very intentional about how we're developing this capacity within individuals, within teams, and within the entire organization is really critical moving forward.
That's fantastic. And what a great place to end it. I want to say a big thank you to our panelists for this really thoughtful and this really generative conversation. You've all made me kind of help me rethink how we're thinking about failure, but also the impact in our systems and our social communities about how this can be put together. And those of you who know me well know that clicking and talking is not my strong suit, but I think I just successfully shared a slide, which is great. But what I am especially excited about is the continuation of this conversation as we move into our third session of Brave Conversations. So what I'm taking away from this conversation is really thinking carefully about how failure is connected to that sense of safety, that sense of relationality, to care, to community, and to sustainability in our work. And this conversation has really made me think carefully about that, and to take that away. And I'd like to extend our sincere thanks to our partners in this series at the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning, in particular to Erica Smith and Jay Overholzer for their ongoing collaboration in bringing Brave Conversations in SoTL to life. These kinds of cross-institutional partnerships are really what makes this series both possible and impactful. And I really appreciate the work that they've put into this second session. And a special thank you as well to our fearless question moderator, Dr. Cherie Wilmer, for holding the space in the chat and helping surface questions and insights in our community, questions that we look forward to bringing into our third session and our closing session for this series this year. Our final session in this three-part series is focused on revisiting and rethinking risk in SoTL. So this will be held on May 7th at 9:00 a.m. until 10:30 a.m. It's also on Zoom. And we are excited to welcome Dr. Peter Felton, Dr. Noreen Mumtaz, and Jay Overholzer to this conversation, which will be moderated and facilitated by Cherie Wilmer, about rethinking and revisiting how we handle risk in SoTL. So in this session, we're going to invite participants to interrogate the uneven terrain of risk and examine how positionality shapes what's possible and what's not within SoTL inquiry. And you can register for that at mru.ca on our Mokakiiks website, and also listserv announcements will be coming out shortly for that. So we look forward to welcoming you to there. We hope today's discussion stays with you as you consider all of your own SoTL work and continue in that journey, and that it invites you to think differently about how failure, care, and risk intersect in your own contexts. So thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and we look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks in May. We'll see you all soon.